Hi, I'm Leanpub from Leanpub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Diana Montalion. Based in Hudson Valley, New York, Diana is a software engineer and team leader and founder of Mentrix, where she designs technology systems and teaches workshops on systems thinking. You can follow her on Twitter at Diana Montalion and on Mastodon at Diana@Hachyderm. It's like, well, you can probably guess how that's spelled. And check out her website at mentrixgroup.com, where you can sign up for her workshops, and you can also find a lot of great talks and interviews with her on YouTube. Diana is the author of the Leanpub book, Writing is Thinking, Practices for Technology Professionals. In the book, Diana shows how a variety of specific writing practices can help us think better about how we think in the first place and help us think better with other people, arriving at practical, actionable outcomes by creating conceptual integrity. In this book, we're going to talk about Diana's background and career, systems thinking and nonlinear thinking, her book, and at the end, we'll talk a little bit about her experience as a writer. So thank you very much, Diana, for being on the Leanpub Front Matter podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. This is all things I love to talk about, so I'm so happy to have an hour to do so.
Awesome. Thank you. I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and how you found your way into a career in tech.
Well, so I spent a lot of years recovering from my childhood, so we probably don't want to go too far into that, because we could spend the whole entire time talking about the impact of trauma and these kinds of things. But I grew up in New England, and I got a lot of what I needed and support from extracurricular kinds of things. So, for example, I always did music and I always did acting and the whole high school. So Fame, the movie Fame, I was going to live forever. That's like, to me, the movie Fame was everything I thought was matterful when I was a kid. And I also was in drum and bugle corps, which is like very complex marching, basically. There's people play instruments. I twirled a sword. Like that was one of my funnest things to practice. And so for me, despite there being a lot of really things that were painful or difficult to move through, there was also a lot of vibrancy in the things that I found to really immerse in. And so the library, for example, I was one of those kids that came home every week with a stack of books that I put under my bed. And it's interesting because even though my career now is not the one I thought when I was 9, I also thought I'd have a horse, and I don't. So I do have 3 dogs and cats and chickens and others. So, but not a horse. I've been thinking lately a lot about how much overlap there is in the kinds of ways that I liked to show up in the world and be in the world when I was a kid, compared to here I am all these years later. Even though, like I say, they're not the same. I didn't stay in doing the same things. I don't do acting anymore. But I did. When I went to college, I only wanted to study theater, and I went to the best school that I knew of to go. And of course, the feedback was, this is a waste. You can't do anything with a degree in theater. Why don't you go into banking? You like banking? I was a teller in a bank in high school. That was my part-time job. And yet, I am strongly informed, and I use it all the time. So I really, and writing and reading and doing all the other things that I did when I was a kid, like I say, even though that's not my career, it's interesting how much those skills have been really, really valuable. And you don't mind being poor when you're 18. So it was the right time to do it.
Yeah, thanks very much for sharing all of that. That's really great. As a former English major who went into investment banking afterwards. I'm familiar with the idea of, skills that transfer over and being told that what you're doing is useless, which is, I don't know, it makes me both laugh and get angry sometimes.
Yeah.
But I gather from your LinkedIn profile that you made this switch eventually. You went back to college, and you studied, I think, both writing and computer science when you did that.
Yeah. So when my son, when it was pretty obvious by the time he was in first grade that the school system wasn't really going to work for us. Like he tested off the scale in some areas and was, his own age group in other areas. And I couldn't find a way to accommodate that. The school was like, well, if he finishes his first grade math work, we'll give him his second grade math workbook. And I'm like, but he's doing high school algebra in his head. Like there's not been, and so there was a lot of trying to figure out what to do to give him what he needed in these varying level ways. And so what happened, we started homeschooling, and he pretty quickly got ahead of me in science. And so I called the local University of Southern Maine, where I was living in Portland, Maine at the time. And I said, my son is young, but he wants to take a course. Is that okay? And they said yes. Then when they found out that he was only 9, they were like, okay, if the professor says yes, and if you come with him, if you bring him. So I brought him to physics in University of Southern Maine, and I just fell in love with it. And when I was a girl, it was very difficult to be someone who loved math and science. That wasn't, you'd be pretty and thin, not good at math. And so, and it wasn't really also where I was going either at the time. And so it was a late bloomer in that way. And so I went back to school to study physics and had to take a computer science course. And when I first went back, and then I fell in love with that even more. Then I'm like, okay, this is so much better. But I had been a writer before I went back to school. And that I went to Stone Coast Writers Conference, which the university holds every year. And so I couldn't decide. I couldn't, like, I had decided I couldn't decide. Even now, as I say it, I can't even finish the sentence because I remember how I couldn't really pull them apart, which if we fast forward 20 years or so, I discover they're not two different things. But at the time, I thought that they were. But also, web courses were in media studies, in the media studies department, and in the engineering department. I learned that my first web class was taught by the engineers, and then computer science was very C++, like 2 years of C++ and algorithms and things like that. And so, because this was my second time around, I didn't need to do 4 years, and I did computer science sort of in the minor track and media studies to have my degree in. But in fact, it was the way that I combined computer science, but specifically for digital technology, which is really, that integration was what was really interesting to me. So I sort of made a mishmash of those skill sets that were spread around in different departments.
And were you always interested? I mean, once you sort of were studying computer science and things like that, was that sort of like systems integration, I guess one might call it? Was that always an interest of yours? That like there's a system level of thinking that's going on that's sort of like different from the coding layer.
Yeah. So what for a long time, I did not have words for myself, right? And so when I finished school, I moved to Montana and bought an independent bookstore. Like, I didn't even dive fully into technology right away because there was still a lot. So the web was still a lot of front end work, design work, which is not really what I do. And there wasn't a lot of back end yet. Now, of course, there is. And so it's interesting because I was being interviewed recently, and we were talking about the bookstore and how I approached it. And he did the tilty head and said, "It's a system. You designed a system." That's right. That's exactly what I did. And so what saved me, what rescued me from not knowing the answer to your question is that over time, everything in the technology world, everything that I was doing software engineering around, the paradigm around us shifted. And now the internet is an information system. And all of the systems thinking that I had always done sort of in the closet, all of the ways that I thought about the world and approaching the world that worked or didn't work really in the software engineering world suddenly became essential. And so when the first role I had called a systems architect, which I've been since, was really just sort of trying to correctly describe the work I had always been doing. And more or less coding, more or less abstraction, those things have varied from circumstance to circumstance. But the being interested in systems is, I'm starting to think I was born that way. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. And to maybe pick a sort of very specific example of what maybe we might be talking about when we're talking about systems. You did a really interesting project for The Economist for a couple of years, which I gather, and which is, by the way, one of my like favorite publications. But partly like it's so good at technology. You like uniquely good, I would say, at least in my as a sort of like amateur newsreader kind of person. The FT is also actually very good. I don't know why they're both in London, if there's some sort of connection happening there. But I gather, so you worked on the system. So basically, there's a bunch of people who have to produce writing, and then that writing has to get published, and then that has to go out to a lot of different people. And was that the kind of thing that you were working on?
Yeah, so when I first worked with them, and I'm so glad to hear, by the way, that your experience with them. That's so. It's always wonderful to feel that you've invested in missions that people really need and appreciate. Like that's something I've really tried to do in my career, is to do things that later on I still feel they're very valuable, right? The mission I was serving. So when they were first my client, I was the lead of a software engineering team where we specialized in Drupal, which is for open source web content software. And at the time, The Economist was adopting it for their web presence, and they were for a while the biggest Drupal instance that there was. And so I worked with the New York team and the London team, and we built this and extended, and we wrote a lot of custom code for this, and then went off and did a bunch of other things over the next, I think, probably 7 years or so. I can't quite remember and then I was moving to New York, and there was a new CTO at The Economist who heard that I was coming there and said, "Oh, are you looking for work?" And they were at the point, as really everyone that I have worked with over the years, of digital transformation. And by this, they mean we used to be a print publication, and then we were a print publication and a website. And now there are 42 destinations for every single article that goes out. And we do films, and we do audio, and we do events. And the print software is becoming obsolete. And so we're going to have to replace it, but we want to replace it in taking a step forward. And also we haven't failed to publish since 1843. So we definitely, going offline is not a thing. And so the systems work that I did with a really great bunch of teammates is figure out what this system can look like, and what the steps are to be able to the system looked like everybody's information system. I used the picture of the Weasley house, the Burrows in the Harry Potter story, because in the picture it's like they add a piece by just sticking it on the house and sticking it on the house. When I first started working on it, I wrote a story about an article being published. And I did that rather than make a traditional architecture model because, A, no one really knew how an article went through the whole system because different people work in different parts, and the mobile team the app team would work separately. And also for lay people to read and understand so that they could really be part of this decision making. So the work with them has really been, since then, the work I predominantly do, because the challenges that they face are the challenges that everyone faces. And the pandemic has made this an even bigger question, because now digital systems have to when I was a girl, we mailed letters, we called each other on the phone. All of these systems, going to a movie, mailing a letter, sharing documents, getting together with friends, going to the pub, all of these things now are all software. We walk around with software in our pockets. And we add software and take software off. And this is just in the last 40 years. There's a tremendous amount of proliferation of software that now is all in relationship to each other.
Yeah,
what do we do?
That's really interesting. Yeah, the concept of digital transformation. I mean, it might, as a term, it might even sound old-fashioned to some people listening. Like, isn't everything digital already? And the answer is actually no.
No.
And like when we say only 40 years, that might make us sound like the ages we are, but really that's not that long. And for the amount of things that have happened, but there are all these legacy systems, and they were actually often very sophisticated. They just weren't digital systems. And so, for example, I know that like the U.S. military, for example, one of its challenges for recruitment is people are like, how do I sign up on the app? And they're like, no, it's a form that you have to fill out with a pen in triplicate kind of thing. And they're like, wait, what? And then that actually sort of lowers trust in the whole system, because these people are coming into it, like new recruits are coming into it with all these expectations from all these other things. But then you also hear about things like the VA, where it's like, got, I don't know, like COBOL kind of systems or something like that, going back really far, which, and so this work of digital transformation and sort of integrating these systems there's still a lot to do.
It's so the integrative aspect is so far behind our desire for it, but there are reasons for that, and some of them are good reasons, and a lot of them are monetizing reasons. I did a long time ago, I did a project for Stanford where they were giving money. They wanted to give money to two journalist organizations, one very esteemed and prestigious, and one grassroots, really on the ground, lots of really good energy happening around their approach to journalism. And they just wanted to provide the ability to share data to back up their journalistic endeavors. And so, how do we do this? And think you kind of don't, because it's improved since then. But the challenge that these platforms, these information, like this, we designed software to say, come over to my house and I'll charge you admission to this great party I have going on in my living room. And that's our business model. Or advertising. This page gets 1 million views a month. And so we can charge you based on that. But now information it's ubiquitous, and we want to be able to engage. Like, you read an Economist article and you want to be able to talk about that and share it and engage it, and you don't go to their website like you might have done even 10 years ago to do this. You're doing it in all these ways. And so how do we even create that relationship, have a relationship with you as a reader of a particular brand? How do we make it available to you? How do we know what you like and be able to keep this relationship? And then also, how is it monetized? So there's all these reasons. And also the tech is still emerging, like the tool set to be able to do this and the rules to be able to do it. But I would argue, and this has been the focus of most of what I do now, is that we're taught to think linearly and mechanistically. Everything we know, and especially the way we approach software, came out of an industrial mindset. And that fails us when we try and design systems. And so it was like 50 years ago, the phrase of this being a crisis arose. And I met a woman recently in her 80s who was probably late 70s, and she was a COBOL programmer. And when I said that I was a systems architect, she said, "Oh, me too." And really? And she's like, and she's telling me the way they were doing systems design in the late 60s and 70s. And she said, "Oh, but it must be better now." No, we're all writing books and teaching workshops because we're reinventing that time. Like, we still haven't understood how to think in systems, how to communicate, how to organize ourselves to be able to meet the challenge of increasing complexity in interrelationships.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That just reminded me of a couple of, I guess, kind of, industry jokes, which might be that, back in the days when programming was new, you kind of tried to get things exactly right. So, for example, when you shot that rocket off to go to the moon, the code better work. As simple as it might have been compared to nowadays. But then with increasing kind of, power on your sort of desktop computer or what have you, and then with the proliferation of the web, we ended up with a lot of like kind of chewing gum and shoestrings kind of being used to sort of make things just barely work. And there are people who will say that like a lot of there was a lot more rigorous thinking going on rather than like kind of just get it out and make it work. And in particular, with the advent of being able to update apps, for example, people will complain that actually people have become really lazy. And that why do you get the sense that everything's broken all the time? And it's because, there's this attitude that you can just update it, but then that gets really complicated with things like continuous delivery. And we had Dave Farley on talking about that, where like actually constantly updating, if you've got the right system behind it, it's the opposite of what I was describing. But anyway, you gave me, I was looking for a segue to ask you a very specific question, and you granted it to me. So thank you very much for doing that. The next thing I wanted to ask you about is you write a lot about and talk a lot about nonlinear thinking. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you mean when you talk about nonlinear thinking and why it's so important to try and grasp what that means.
So the reason, first I'll start with, that I say nonlinear thinking is because systems thinking, which I also use and write about, but it's being defined and explored differently, and like between academia, or you can take marketing workshops in systems thinking for products and in business, and we don't really have a good vocabulary yet. So it can mean different things depending on the origin. But they also mean pattern thinking. And that when you described how we so wonderfully actually about how we designed software in this more industrial way, but good and like when this goes, it better work. Like there's lives on the line here, so we need to get the software right. And then we started having this freedom to duct tape things, and that's good enough. And we can get, everybody's afraid to do a prototype because it ends up in production and it stays there for forever. And now we're at this place where we need to be able to design for emergence. So we need to be able to design parts that you can build with some sense of autonomy, and that the relationships between these parts make more than any of the parts could do on their own. So that the relationship then gives you all these qualities that you need in your software system. And in order to design for emergence in technology, we have to be able to do that between the people that are building technology, right? Everything in production is only what we thought and talked about and decided and then did. And so this whole process of being able to create processes designed for emergence, think about patterns, think about relationships between things, choreography, the timing of things, how counterintuitive systems can be. We think we know and then discover that we don't. All of these mindset shifts really kind of all have their own vocabulary. And if I use one of them exclusively, I'm kind of leaving out the others. Also, the fifth discipline, so Peter Senge's book, which is still I think one of the fifth best-selling in its genre, is a systems thinking book. And it's basically that learning teams are systems thinking teams. Learning and metacognition are completely inextricable from nonlinear and systems thinking. And so the reason that it became such a focus for me is because in these big initiatives, the idea of digital transformation has sort of even become a buzzword. It's like getting old and faded, and yet we still haven't really done it. Like as you said, right? We think that we don't really realize how siloed these and how much we're trying to do an emergent process in a linear style. And so it's just the Titanic over and over and over again. They hit, these big initiatives hit an iceberg and they sink. And it became clear to me that the iceberg is we don't think in systems. We don't think in systems. We don't interrelate together. We don't set up our processes to support this. And then we're surprised when it doesn't succeed.
Yeah, that's really great. It's and very evocative, especially the way you're using the concept of emergence there. I was just trying to think of I did note that was interesting when you said that you were sort of doing this work for The Economist, and then you sort of wrote a story about like the tale of an article, right? How is it conceived and how is it eventually published and how does it eventually go out? But I think I would imagine normally when sort of like kind of got some kind of programming task, it's kind of like, well, let's think about the code and let's think about features and stuff like that. But is taking a step back and going, you know what, let's just write a story about an article from beginning to end. Is that an example of nonlinear thinking?
Yeah, and when you're doing nonlinear thinking about relationships, right? It's this ability to take things apart without breaking them. So, we used to upgrade. So we spend years working on, extending a giant piece of software. And then the next version would come out and we migrate. And you migrate, you export the data and import the data and you resign. But over the last, especially the last maybe 5 or 8 years, our information systems can't do that anymore. We have 8 apps that take in for some of this information and refashion it. In the case of The Economist, there's a lot of human moving, cutting, pasting, moving, especially images. At least there was. I can't speak for what it is now, but there was at the time, and that's not unusual. If you have a little recipe blog, so I publish a newsletter, and the newsletter, I do. The newsletter goes out in the software it goes out in, and then I put it in the software of the website, and then I put it into software to go to different social media platforms with a different summary. Now, I know how to code this and make it work, and I get lazy, and I use downloadable, quick things and cut and paste, which then costs me more time in the end than it would for me to just use a graph, put everything in a graph and build front ends to script it. But as you so well pointed out, these legacy systems have business critical processes and relationships between software and data, and they don't talk to each other. One of my favorite SKCDs, and it's in every system I saw, is this tiny little Python script that somebody, no one even remembers who, wrote, that exports a big, something important, and so it can be imported. And if it breaks, the whole system will break. It'll go down. And so we're this sophistication of being able to share information with any context. Users are coming at information from all kinds of contexts. So we access something on our phone. We usually want different information than what we want when we're on our desktop. And so we even want software to give us information that we used to think of as a web page. Now we don't. A web page is becoming obsolete. We want information that fits the context that we're in when we ask for that information. And so systems thinking is about that. It's about architecting information systems that can change and adapt to the context and the new contexts that are coming without having to go back at the beginning and rewrite all the software again to meet these emerging changes. So, it's about what's the structure of this information, what's the events that are happening in the system, and how do we feed these events and use them, and how do we enable the choreography to be changing and flexible and adaptive as opposed to just call and response. You need something, I give you everything.
And just to segue maybe into the next part of the interview and where we go, galaxy brain, because if you think about, we were thinking about systems, and when we were thinking about systems and the way you were talking, we were thinking about, computer systems and like systems of publication and systems of consumption. But then there's the systems that we're using to articulate those things, which is our own thinking and our own communicating and writing. So we have to kind of, you mentioned metacognition, and like there is this step that you have to do, where you have to start thinking about yourself. And that can be very complicated. And of course, and as you mentioned, maybe unless you've read a lot of, Hegel and Heidegger or something like that, having a kind of like sophisticated little terminology even for thinking about thinking is something that you just won't have it from your common sense everyday interactions with things. And it's not a lack or a failure. It's just like, it's just not something that common sense is attuned to, maybe because if we were, we couldn't get anything done. But I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about, like, maybe if we could talk about, move on to talking about your book, Writing is Thinking, Practices for Technology Professionals, because there are these sort of very straightforward practices that one can start with in order to build up, that you write about. And before we go into maybe what those specific practices are, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the concept of conceptual integrity, and what that means and why it's so important.
Yeah. So, yes. And I love that we segued in, in this way, because the thing that happened for me is the more I was doing systems, the more I was doing it through written communication. And so I literally had a moment in my life where I went into a cabin in the woods for the weekend to decide if I was going to be a writer or a coder. And I decided to be a coder, and I moved to Austin, Texas so that I could have the career that I wanted to have. And then down the road discovered that these are communication roles. It's different type and style of communication, but these are communication roles. And so the conceptual integrity, Fred Brooks says, is the most important consideration in systems design. But we struggle to define it. It's sort of like pointing at the moon rather than having the experience of the moon. But what it basically means, if you think of the most basic system that Donella Meadows describes, you have input coming into a state and output. So you think of a bathtub, for example, right? So you turn the water on to fill the bathtub, you plug the plug so it doesn't go out of the bathtub, and then you have a goal in mind. Like, okay, I'd like it to be full enough so it doesn't overflow when I get into it and a particular temperature. And so you start with discrepancies. It's empty, and so you're going to need such and such volume of water. You want it to be such and such temperature. And so the process over time is that the discrepancies diminish as you move towards your goal. And so we're always in a situation where there's a whole bunch of inputs and outputs and changing states. It's why there's so much complexity. So ideas, when we're working, for example, if we're working, we're technology professional, we're working on technology teams, then there's a whole bunch of ideas and opinions and attitudes about how to build things, what we should build, what's the most important thing, which tools should we use, what practices. And then output is what we actually then put out into production, what we act on. And so conceptual integrity is the ability to take this giant bathtub of ideas, working code, all of the things that go into the cognitive structure, the conceptual structure of what we're building, and be able to identify goals and processes for resolving discrepancy, and also understanding how the relationships between have all these simultaneous inputs and outputs, and the world around it is changing. World around your system, you might have a goal, and then there's a pandemic, and suddenly how many goals, technology goals, got abandoned in May of 2020 because they no longer served the world we were living in, right? So conceptual integrity is about being able to make something, this process of thinking and ideas and constructing, but have it have a sense of cohesion, have it hang together, and have a sense of wholeness. Fred Brooks says, if you look at a system, it looks like it's designed from one mind. And that doesn't work great for me, because I don't think it matters so much that it is one mind, but it does matter that it has some integrity, that there's good, strong relationships between the parts, that it doesn't look like the Weasley house, right? It doesn't look like it's duct taped and, you just spit on this to stick it to something else. There's an elegance to how the system works and how the system evolves. And it also, conceptual integrity helps to prioritize and decide, as you're making changes, what's the deepest, most valuable mission that you're serving? Like, what is it? An analogy I use a lot, because it's in every code base, is one group in the organization wanted a car. One group in the organization wanted a boat. So the engineers built a car boat. Nobody wanted a car boat. And so everybody's unhappy with a car boat. And this question of why can't we discern whether to build a car, whether to build a boat, how to do that process of reconciling these, all of that arises from conceptual integrity, right? Rather than car boat is not conceptual integrity. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's or the Homer. I think what was the car that Homer got to build once in a famous Simpsons episode. Remember that one where it had like, I don't know, like a big cup and a big holder for the big cup. And anyway, it's hilarious. But that reminds me of, it's a sort of designed by committee thing. But something that you said struck me about, particularly when you mentioned the pandemic. But this idea of conceptual integrity, and also the idea that like when you're thinking about it, like there's the bathtub and the process of filling a bathtub and organizing a bath, but there's a cognitive structure that people must have of this, in addition to this sort of system that we might think of external to ourselves. And one super, like when you talk about big projects failing, one of the sort of thoughts I have around this is that we can often have a vocabulary that kind of, we use the same vocabulary, the same words even, and even the same grammar to talk about very different things. And this can cause, when the conceptual integrity isn't actually there, and it's not simply a matter of agreement. When the conceptual integrity isn't there, things break down. And so, for example, one thing that became clear when the pandemic happened was that people used the word work to mean very different things. So, for example, it's time to get back to work is something people will say. What they mean is go to a central office. Mm-hmm. And one thing that became very clear was that a lot of people didn't, I'm going to try to say this without being I'm very judgmental about this, but like there are a lot of people for whom work actually was the process of like getting up and putting on a certain type of outfit and going to a certain place for a certain time of day and interacting with people in a kind of whatever level of hierarchy there is. That was what work was to them. The actual, as it were, kind of output was the behaviors. That's it. And anyway, I don't know exactly where I'm going with that, but it struck me that, for a lot of people, they can have this sort of we think we have a shared mental model, and things can actually really kind of go in parallel, but you're actually up to very different things. And if you can't articulate what you're doing, you even can articulate things in the same words and still have a very different concept that you're carrying out.
The example that I use is to go into a situation and say agile and then see what happens, right? Because that is, nowadays, that word means so many different things. And also it depends on your experience. If you've had really good experiences, you're like, ooh, this person's really trustworthy. If you've had bad experiences, you're like, we don't make her go away. Like, we don't want to talk to her. And when it comes to this kind of work, conceptual integrity, you hit on it exactly this. And my colleagues and I talk about this a lot. We don't have a vocabulary yet. We kind of do, but when you use it, you move forward thinking everyone's solving the same problem, but they're not solving this. They didn't even start. I have been in meetings where it's as if everyone has a different why this matters. And the discussion ends up going around and around and around. And it's not because people agree or disagree or what. It's because they're not even, it's the blind man and the elephant, the cartoon of they're not solving, no one's seeing the whole. And so, and you touched on this too, because it's so important to me. One of the things I started doing, and I felt so controversial, like, oh, I'm going to completely ruin any credibility in tech that I have whatsoever. But when I teach on this, I start with self-awareness. You cannot change your mind if you are not aware of what you think, feel, and experience, and that you are the system. You are the generative system, and that self-awareness, the process of cultivating self-awareness is the essential systems skill. And this I thought this was going to be more challenging to audience of technical professionals who are like, where's the Kubernetes? This is not like, there's no Kafka in this story. I'm not interested. But in fact, It seems to be resonating with more than just, the people I already knew that thought like that. And I think it's because that's really exactly what you said. All of the systems challenges that we're experiencing politically and on the planet as a whole, and having gone through the pandemic and in our technology around us, and what do? We are drowning in systems problems. And I think for a lot of people, that's come the awareness that there is no status quo, business as usual process to just 10 steps and the last one will surprise you, that's going to help us solve some of these problems. And so I think that people have gotten a bit drowned out in this push for linear models, command and control, predictable McDonald's models of delivery. But the McDonald's models, they're not helping us now. And they do, to some extent. I don't want to, it's not a binary, right? You can't build software without linear thinking and without being able to build in this way. And a little bit of control sometimes goes a long way towards creating something. Simultaneously, it's only one way of thinking. It's not the way, it's a way. Yeah.
It's interesting. One of the things that I know when I was doing research for this interview, I was watching some of your talks on YouTube and things like that, and you talk about the sort of paradox of kind of trying to teach systems thinking. And I'm putting this in my own words, not in yours, so I don't want to misrepresent anything. But I've got this formulation about there's certain kinds of powers that must be possessed in order to be perceived. Like you can't know what the power of a certain kind of thing is until you actually have it. But then there's just this inherent problem in teaching it to someone, because they have to trust you that there's going to be some revelation that they're going to have along the way. And you've written a book with starting points for how one can do this, because as you're saying, writing and thinking, like concept and communication, these are very linked things. So just to talk a little bit about your book, what are some of the practices that you suggest that people can maybe start with or do in their day-to-day lives to try to get better at sort of this kind of thinking about yourself and then thinking about yourselves in groups?
Yeah, so this was actually perfect. We arrived at this is a great came in at the exact right time, because I don't know why it took me so long, but what I realized was that practices I had. So for example, every morning I get up, I go downstairs, I make myself a silk creamer. This is the only creamer for me in the world. Make myself an espresso, come up, I say good morning to Alexa. She gives me information that I need and sets a timer for an hour, and I write by hand every morning. And I've been doing this for a very long time. And I don't know how I would think without this practice. And I began to realize how much my writing practices and the ways that I support my ability to think are really essential to the work I do in technology. So in the very first thing when a group of us, when I make a workshop and the group gets together, that's the first thing I ask everyone to do. So you get up in the morning, you can just write, a page or 3 pages. You can set a timer. It took me a long time to get to an hour. Like, don't do in an hour, just do. And it led to the discussion, if you have kids, when is your morning? Because it isn't, because you get woken up. So we start with this process of getting rid of the talking to people and just make some space to think, to listen to your own mind and your own experiences, and to listen to whatever it is that arises while you're doing this physical activity of writing, because we're very cramped and we're constantly consuming information that is socially engineered to manipulate how we think. We lose track of how we think. And so that practice of writing just right, Just right. No other rules except consistency in how you do it. And then from there to move into a focused writing session. So trying to make some space for yourself during your day where you have an idea of an artifact of some form of written communication that you're trying to create, and that you immediately learn how cramped with expectation so much of your time is. And then the third from there, which so far a lot of people that I've worked with have found the most powerful, is designing feedback loops. So we live in a situation in which feedback is a very tricky, like it's, you're wrong. Let's start with this is wrong and this is wrong and this is wrong. And in order to improve the way that we're thinking, we need feedback that helps strengthen the reasons that support our conclusions. So if I say, I recommend that we do this in this circumstance, here's the thing that the mission we serve, and here's a recommendation that can help us move in that direction. Here are the 3 reasons that convinced me that this is a good direction for us to go in. When I get feedback, what I want to do first is strengthen those reasons, uncover any blind spots. Perhaps there's a whole piece of this situation I didn't even know. So I'm then engaging with other people's expertise to help me create conceptual integrity, to create cohesion in this recommendation. Not is it right or wrong, not are we going to have a political war about this yet. That's coming. That happens. We have to go there. There will be a presentation on slides, usually at some point in the lifespan of an idea. But for now, for the beginning, you're trying to make it as strong and well thought out and from multiple points of view so that you really can see the pros and cons of what you're trying to do. And so when we design feedback loops that help us do that, we're automatically thinking well together. And we can do that with other people too. And that is a place to start, as opposed to what we usually do, which is we're opinion driven. Here's my opinion, change my mind. Here's my opinion, change my mind. But nobody's not, so I was asked once in a podcast interview, I loved this moment because it never occurred to me. We talked about cat herding roles. An architect is often that, for a systems architect, it can be a cat herding role where you're kind of trying to get all these agendas integrated. And I was like, you know what? Nobody gets to be a cat. And ever since it came out of my mouth, I'm like, that's really what I think. I really do. No one gets to be a cat. That we have to all be leaning in a bit to be critically thinking with other people and not just say, this looks like a graph, graphs don't scale. What convinced you? What are the reasons? How do we engage more deeply? Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really great, especially thinking about as a system that we're self-aware of as a group, where feedback is not the same thing as opinion.
Yes.
And once, but we have to talk about it to get to that place where we've agreed on that. Oh, right. Yeah, no. What we mean by feedback here is giving reasons or an explanation rather than simply a conclusion or an expression of an intuition or something like that. We could talk about this for a long time. There's one thing when it comes to feedback as well. There's sort of interesting things that you talk about where there's a thing called that you talk about called fear thinking, which I when I came across that phrase, I was like, oh, that's me. Or me most of the time, which is like the feedback I want is you didn't fuck up. And that's what I'm intuitively looking for. And so, but becoming self-aware, not just about what other people are giving you, but what you're expecting and what you're responding to and why, can just be incredibly helpful. The last question I wanted to ask you about your book is something you drop in there, which is you insist on that writing by hand, like with a pen or a pencil, is a crucial element of this writing practice that you do in your morning. And I was just wondering if you could take a moment to talk about that to maybe sort of people who are skeptical about why like writing with a pen would be so important.
I love this question. And I want to say very quickly the fear writing, this question of, am I right? Which I totally get. The beauty of complexity is that you can't ever know. So you might as well stop seeking it, because you can just come up the best possible solution under the circumstances right now. That's it. That's as good as it gets. There's no right. It's kind of liberating, but I still have the same. Is this good? Is this good? So the experience is part of the reason that I advocate for this. And I only have theories that I have no real justification for. I mean, other people have said the same theories about the physical act of moving the hand, right? Of forming the letters. It's kind of like painting the words rather than typing the words. Works differently in our minds. It gives us a much more intimate physical experience of what we're thinking and experiencing. And for me, I've done this free writing with digital tools. I even tried it with my iPad and the stylus, and it's lighter. It's kind of like eating junk food in my body rather than what it's like to do real food. So what I say to people is start with by hand, because everything in, a lot of experience has showed me that that's the way to create the physical interconnection, the physical experience. And then if it doesn't work for you, you can try and see. And maybe I'm wrong, or maybe I'm wrong for some people, or maybe I'm wrong for people who grew up always writing with their thumbs, which I didn't. But I do think that there is a quality to painting the words, writing the words, the visceral experience of that gives us a lot more access. And a lot less, we feel a lot less like we're communicating outside of ourselves, and a lot more like it's more yoga and meditation or all of these other physical activities, and less the conditioned pattern of I'm talking to somebody, like I'm saying something, I'm putting something out. I think I do both, obviously, right? I don't write everything by hand. I do both. But for the morning practice, I feel very confident that that's the place to start, at least, and see if I'm right for any individual. Some people, the morning practice they abandon it. They never come back to it. So, but most people that I've worked with find it beneficial by hand. So I trust it enough to try. Yes.
Thanks very much for that really great explanation. It reminded me of something. I mean, and this is, generational, but, I remember some of like the sort of most exciting thinking I've had in my own life was in lectures when I'd just to go down a path and I'd start writing out in my notebook, things. And the big difference between that and typing was that typing is kind of like for other people in a sense. Whereas handwriting was kind of just for me. So handwriting was more like thoughts, like rather than, it was the thinking itself rather than communicating. But anyway, thanks very much for that. That's great. And like, as you say, like everyone try it for yourself, see if it works, see what works. And you might be pleasantly surprised. The last question I always like to ask on the podcast, if the guest has been using Leanpub, is if there was, when you were using Leanpub, if there was one thing that had you shaking your fist going, damn you, Leanpub, or that we could fix for you, or if there was one magical feature that we could build for you, is there anything that you can think of that you would ask us to do?
Well, so the first thing is I want to thank you for the GitHub integration. Like that I love that, like 100% love that. And the only trouble that I had is that I had Markdown that was underlined, and it went past the end of this into the margin. And so I took out the underlines of a sentence that was longer than one line. And I didn't try and solve it. I didn't care. I didn't even mean to use the underline. I think I meant italics, so it didn't hurt me. But I don't know why the formatting got broken. This is the only challenge that I've had.
Yeah, thanks very much for that really detailed feedback. That's really great. I've already got an idea of how I can try and reproduce it. Things going out into the margin has been just this, like, we kind of solved it in a way, like not too long ago, actually, after like a really long time of having big problems with that, particularly with like monocode kind of like inline code samples. Those kinds of things would
Yeah.
spill over into the margins a lot. So anyway, yeah, no, thanks very much for that. That's really great. And thank you very much for taking some time out of your day to talk to me and to talk to our audience. And thank you very much for being a Leanpub author.
Well, my pleasure. I'm so appreciative of your mission and what you're trying to do, and for making this time to talk. I just a big fan, and I really appreciate. And it was a very enjoyable. I can't believe the time's gone by already. It was very enjoyable to talk to you. So I have to write more books and publish them on after I finish this, and keep publishing on Leanpub so we can do more.
Please do. Thanks.